For the third time in the last 20 years, TCU baseball will not be dancing as they have been left out of the NCAA tournament. Men's basketball has finished their portal recruiting and has a full roster, plus a national championship is in the books for TCU, and women's basketball is rounding out their roster as well. All that and more on this episode of Frogs Insider. Hello and welcome in to another episode of Frogs Insider. Jamie Plunkett here with Melissa Treebwasser as always. Episode 68. Melissa, a jam-packed, content-filled episode this time around.
On this holiday weekend. You might be having the day off, but the frog news never stops, Jamie. So here we are, Memorial Day. Making up for missing last week, and boy, do we have some things to talk about today.
We're making up for missing last week, and it turns out TCU men's baseball will be missing the NCAA tournament after they were left out on a relatively controversial selection show Monday morning. Not necessarily because TCU got left out, although I do think it's fair for the Frogs to feel a little snubbed in that department. We're going to get into all of that here in just a few moments. First and foremost, though, thank you to Dave Campbell's Texas Football and the Republic of Football Network, of which we are a part. You can find those podcast streams wherever you find your podcasts. Just search Republic of Football and it will pop up. You'll get our show along with all of the shows for every D1 school in the state of Texas. A lot of really fun content, especially this time of year as folks are breaking down spring football and doing some similar conversations to us, talking about hoops transfer portal and whether their baseball team's doing well or not and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of great content across the network. And if you just want TCU content only, you can search Frogs Insider wherever you get your podcasts or go to our YouTube channel and you can find just TCU related content over there. And also a big shout out to Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods, our presenting sponsor for the show. They've got everything you need to get ready for a game day, which now you got some runway to go online.
Got a little time to plan ahead.
Get some great shirts or polos or pullovers or hats or a koozie over at hellshalfacresg.com. They're wrapping up their Memorial Day sale this weekend as well.
I dropped a little coin. Yeah, I dropped a little coin on it.
Oh,
yeah,
my gosh.
50% off every TCU related thing. It was a killer deal.
Which is hilarious because it's like 50% off the whole site, basically.
Yeah.
Which is so great. Just such a cool deal. They do deals all the time. Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods, hellshalfacresg.com. And if you do go and buy something from Hell's Half Acre, make sure that when you're checking out, you drop a little comment in the comment box that says Frogs Insider sent you. We do love our partners over there at Hell's Half Acre, and we want to let them know that their sponsorship of this show is working for them. So shout out to Hell's Half Acre and Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Melissa, question for you right out of the gate. Does TCU have a right to feel snubbed from the NCAA tournament?
So I think two things can be true. I think that you can say, in light of some of the teams that did make it in, like obviously the two big ones that we're hearing thrown around are Florida and Kansas State. TCU had a better resume overall than either of those two programs, and had a 3-1, standing against Kansas State. And so, yes, you can say that team has the right to feel snubbed, but also when you look at the season, especially the conference season, if you don't put it in context of who got in over them, I think you can say they kind of made their bed themselves this year. I mean, there were plenty of opportunities. You can point to the sweep at Cincinnati. You can point to, what happened up in Lawrence. I mean, there were plenty of opportunities for them to win games. And what happened, in the final series, if they win 2 out of 3 instead of 1 out of 3 against West Virginia, we're probably not having this conversation. So, yes, but I'm not going to sit here and act hurt by the fact that TCU did not make the tournament. They were snubbed, but also there's enough of an argument that they weren't necessarily deserving, although a bigger argument that they were deserving over some of their peers.
Yeah, I think I lean in that direction. I tweeted something similar earlier in the day, just that we as human beings are capable of holding two separate and distinct thoughts in our heads at the same time, because I saw a lot of this back and forth between TCU fans about, well, we didn't deserve to get in, so it's not a big deal, versus, oh, we got snubbed, we should have been in over Indiana or Georgia Tech or Florida or James Madison, some of these other schools, when in reality I think they're both, like you said, kind of arguing two sides of the same coin, where you're right, they dropped a lot of opportunities. Cincinnati being probably the biggest one on the resume. Getting swept by Cincinnati is tough. But at the same time, it was a little bit of a hectic at-large year across the board. And you're talking about a Florida team that was 28 and 27 overall, 13 and 17 in conference play, right? You had several SEC teams that got in at 13 and 17 with a conference record. That so there's some questions there about what
11 SEC teams getting in is ridiculous this year.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
It probably shouldn't have been that way. I would have liked to have seen TCU in over Florida, but again, Jack Caglianone is a huge name in college baseball, and you want to get your stars in. I thought TCU with Peyton Tolley had a pretty good driving force, but not beyond resume. When you talk about kind of legacy programs and star power and all that kind of stuff, you could probably make the argument there. In fact, Mike Rooney did briefly on ESPN's selection show on Monday say, I would have liked to have seen TCU in this tournament. Kendall Rogers, who's the managing editor for D1 Baseball, says that he's disappointed that the committee left TCU out. So there are some national voices that are also saying that they're a little bit surprised and displeased with the fact that TCU is not in the field of 64 this postseason. And I tend to agree with them as well. Despite some of the deficiencies on TCU's resume, you got to look at the 13-0 start. One of the better non-conference seasons in college baseball, with wins over DBU, a win over Arizona, who's hosting, 8-0 against the Pac-12 on the whole. I thought it was a good enough resume this year to get in, despite the fact that you can probably qualify TCU's season as a disappointment because they finished ninth in conference when they were the overwhelming favorite to finish first in the Big 12. And so you got to take the good with the bad and really look at it all. The biggest question marks for me by the committee, though, weren't really even TCU related. I don't know that the committee really even took RPI into consideration hardly at all. When you look at the fact that Arizona is hosting when they have the number 31 overall RPI. That being said, I'm okay with them hosting, right? The bigger question is East Carolina getting a regional site when you have Indiana State sitting there at number 10 overall in the RPI. You have Duke sitting there after they just won the ACC tournament. Both of those I thought were more viable options to host than East Carolina. And then you send Indiana State to a national seed, and not just any. You send them to Kentucky, the number 2 overall seed in the tournament. What did Indiana State do to offend this selection committee? I'll never know. You have Northeastern not getting in despite all of the metrics being in their favor, and they went out and they sought out an incredibly difficult non-conference schedule, won most of those games, performed well in conference, had the RPI metrics, had the KPI metrics, had the strength of schedule metrics, didn't get in. But you've got Indiana, who's 55th in RPI and 49th in KPI and 39th in strength of schedule, getting in over some teams that had much better metrics as well. So a lot of question marks from the committee this year, not to mention that some of those committee members' home institutions were squarely on the bubble and made their way in as well. Indiana being one, Kansas State being another. Just question marks all around. I will say this about Kansas State. I don't really have a problem with them getting in, because what they did in non-conference this year, I thought Phil Hughes said his piece last year, was really critical of the importance of non-conference midweek games, and then said, screw it, we're going to go do what we can to make our non-conference resume better. He played Clemson in the midweek. He played Tennessee in the midweek. He sought out better non-conference tournaments for his program. So I liked what they did with the schedule. The head-to-head stuff with TCU obviously is going to be a hiccup for TCU fans specifically, but just generally, I'm okay with Kansas State getting in the tournament. I didn't think it should have been at the expense of TCU, though.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I feel like we're having a similar conversation to what we had at the end of football season of, if TCU makes the tournament this year, does it allow them to continue with the status quo? and is not making the tournament maybe a good thing to force there to be roster shakeup, responsibility shakeup, and with all of the question marks we've had this season. Sometimes you have to kind of hit. I don't know that this is rock bottom, but I think you could argue that being a preseason top 5 program and a number 1, a near unanimous pick to win your league, and then to fall to 9th and not make the postseason at all, it does kind of make you kind of look in the mirror and really examine what you're doing, what went wrong, and why it went wrong, and what can you do to address what went wrong. And I think there's plenty of things that we can look at on the TCU team that need to be addressed. We saw great things by the pitchers, and we saw some pitchers really regress. We saw the bullpen step up. The starting lineup was an absolute disaster for most of the season outside of Peyton Tolley. Obviously the bats could come alive in moments, but they were not consistent. And the team batting average and run production and power production, based on what we heard out of the fall, was just not acceptable, frankly. And so I think that means either, I'm not calling for anybody to lose their job. I'll let anonymous TCU Twitter handle those types of things. That's not really my style. But at the very least, I think every coach and person involved in that program needs to kind of sit down and say, what do we need to do differently in order to put our players in a position to be more successful? And I think, to me, it's a fair question to ask because there was so much regression. We saw guys that had performed at a higher level of season before, and there's some of that is natural. But I think, if TCU makes a bowl game, maybe Sonny sticks with the status quo. But because TCU didn't make a bowl game, he felt more pressure to make changes. And I'm not talking just about, it's not just, doesn't have to be just firing a coach. But look at how many support staff they added. Look at how they addressed how they're attacking recruiting. There are things you can do, and baseball doesn't have the resources of football, obviously, but there are things you can do within your program that don't necessarily mean making staff changes, that can change how you execute things. And Kirk had an amazing end of the season run last year and struggled during the regular season. And so now we've seen a little bit of a pattern. We didn't get that hot streak, that, 7 week hot streak that we got last season this year. And we saw what happens when you don't perform consistently throughout the season. So I would listen, and this makes me a bad TCU fan, but if I was a person who knew the results ahead of time, if you told me that my option was go to College Station as a 3 seed and end up getting just roped by Texas A&M, or not make the tournament and have a kind of big long look in the mirror, I'm choosing the latter every single time.
I don't know.
I know, and I know I should want TCU to make the postseason every single time, but I did not want to go. And if we win, that's a different thing. I'm not saying we couldn't have competed, but man, losing to Jim Schlossnagel's super team this year of all years would have really just been very, very painful. So I would always rather have TCU have an opportunity to compete for a championship. Like, obviously, that goes without saying. But in this instance, sometimes I think that not accomplishing your goals forces you to really examine your program, whereas getting partially to your goal allows you sometimes to stay in that complacency. And I don't think Kirk Saarloos will be taking this offseason with any level of complacency.
Oh, that's I 100% agree with you there. I think that most coaches are pretty hyper competitive to be in the space that they're in, and for someone to be at the head of a program who has been so rock solid good for as long as TCU baseball has been, I think we can fully expect Kirk to turn over every single stone when it comes to finding a path back, not only to the NCAA tournament, that should be the baseline, but competing for an opportunity to play in Omaha again and winning Big 12 titles again. Because since TCU baseball has been in the Big 12, they have twice as many conference championships between the regular season and the tournament as anyone else in the league. And that sets a standard, that sets an expectation, and this year they didn't reach it. And sometimes that happens. How you respond makes all the difference in the world. And like you said, I think Kirk Saarloos is really going to attack this offseason and leave no stone unturned in so far as trying to put this program back on the right foot again.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. It's such a different. We've come off disappointing seasons in baseball before, just not very often. So we don't handle it well, apparently, as a fan base. But it's such a different world because of the portal and because of how different baseball is. And with this settlement coming down too, we may see quite a few changes that impact roster and scholarship ability here. Maybe not for this coming season, but within the next 2 years, it sounds like. So you can address your problems a lot easier, and you can also see players bail out of a situation they're not happy with a lot easier. And so I have a feeling we'll see a lot of roster changes. I think there are guys we obviously want to hold on to. That we'd love to see return. There are young players coming in that are very, very promising that we'd like to see play. But that's the balancing act, I think for Kirk this offseason is how much do you turn over to these highly recruited guys that you brought in this year or you're bringing in this coming year versus how much do you go and try to plug holes with established players. And that's a tough thing to do in baseball, especially because there's so much unknown up until, July when the draft happens. And TCU has several draft eligible young players that will have a tough decision to make. Do they does the disappointment and how they perform, how their team perform, brings them back for one more run, or do they take advantage? Even like Anthony Silva is obviously the big one. Is he did not perform up to expectations, but he's still probably a top 150 draft prospect. So if he gets drafted, if he's not a first rounder, does he come back? Or does he still go and pursue his professional dreams? And those are the kind of players that it's going to really impact not just TCU's performance on the field, but the leadership in the locker room and how they go about rebuilding the foundation of this program.
Yeah, I mean, you're graduating 9 guys, so those guys aren't coming back. And then you talked about Silva being draft eligible, Peyton Tolley, Cademan Parker, Zach Coyer, Logan Maxwell, all draft eligible guys as well that are, I could see a world in which all of those guys are professional baseball players next year. And so then you're asking some really big questions about how many guys do we have to go get in the transfer portal? How many guys are we going to rely on from this freshman class? Like you said, when there are a couple guys in that freshman class who very easily could be draft casualties as well. And then you're starting to talk about, okay, well, is this a 2018 kind of situation all over again where you had some big names in your recruiting classes that were draft casualties, you didn't backfill properly, and you missed a tournament, and now you've lost some talent off those College World Series rosters, and you saw a couple tough seasons there in 18 and 19 for TCU. Is that kind of, are we at that point in the cycle again? I think is a fair question to ask, and it all, we'll get some answers as the summer progresses.
I can answer it right now. Build the entire lineup out of Sam Myers.
Right.
Just build the entire thing. He's been unbelievable.
There were plenty of bright spots on this roster this year.
Sure.
And Sam was absolutely one of them.
Yeah, and Sam come back. That's all I'm saying. Like that's the one guy where I'm like I couldn't. I mean, there are several that would be heartbreaking, but that's the one guy I'm like no. Like I want to build this team around a kid like Sam Myers. In so many ways, he's been unbelievable.
It's funny that you bring him up because all offseason, what I try to do is just get intel on what people think of players that are coming into the program and what their skill set is, what they're talented at, where they can contribute and that kind of stuff. And every time I talk to somebody about Sam Myers, really the only feedback I would get is he's just a baseball player.
Yeah, he's
right?
a dog, man.
And he might not be a 3, 4, 5 tool guy, but he's a grinder. He gives you great at bats. He plays incredibly good defense. He's fast as hell on the bases. And he was wildly productive in his freshman year for TCU, despite not really breaking through in the lineup consistently until the last 6-7 weeks of the season. And I think he's one of those guys that when you look at this next year for TCU, how does he manage to avoid that sophomore slump that we saw so many of the sophomores take this year? Because I think that you still have the bones of a really talented squad if you talk about Klecker and Bowen and Abelt and Myers and Ryder Robinson, Chase Brunson, right? Like Brody Green probably coming back. Like all of these guys that
Jack Arthur, who
was fantastic in the back half of the year, right? Like you've got the bones of something really, really good. I will die on the hill that I thought this team was way more talented than the results ever bore out. And so you return a lot of talent. But again, like you said, this summer, you gotta nail it. This summer, they really do.
Some of your, I think your lineup confusion gets naturally solved by graduating. Like you don't have to try to find a way to get Curtis Byrne and
Carson Bowen.
Thank you. Why did I don't know.
That's
I did
all
that.
good.
It's been one of those days.
Yeah,
you don't have to get both of those guys in the lineup. You can have a true first baseman. Carson probably goes back to being your everyday catcher with a backup because
which he's perfectly capable of doing,
yes,
and probably for
Yeah.
for consistency's sake at the plate will be better for him.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And he started to really turn it on and find some gaps in the defense towards the end of the year too. So I think that helps. You've got a pretty dang good young first baseman waiting in the wings who hopefully bid his time this year, but is willing to go out and earn the job next year. Third base, you've got plenty of good defensive options and guys that showed when they're healthy they can be effective offensive players. Some of your logjam positions, I think those issues go away, but you're going to have to probably either identify or go out and find at least one, potentially two weekend rotation guys, and that is really, really hard to add in weekend rotation guys out of the transfer portal. For every Peyton Tolley, there's 100 stories of it not working out that well. So, and you need to kind of fix what got broken with guys like Cole Klecker. And we saw Luis Rodriguez have some really great moments, but we saw him be inconsistent as well. The arm talent is there. Like I said, talent is not an issue. But how do you get that talent to perform at the level it's capable of, or the level of expectation that kind of came with it? And that's where I think the coaching staff just really needs to evaluate not just how they recruit and how they get guys onto the field, but how are we developing? And there's nothing wrong with making adjustments. This is a very different college baseball world than there was a year ago. And I have no problem with them looking and making changes and examining those things. But, the status quo, I don't think is acceptable for anybody involved with TCU baseball. I mean, it's one thing for us as fans to complain about it, but like you said, this is a program that for 20 years has been one of the best programs in the country. They are not going to accept mediocrity without trying everything that they can to do what they can to get this team back on the path to Omaha. And I think your point about the cycle is fair. It might not be another great year for TCU, but I don't think it's unfair to have the expectation that this team is in the field of 64 pretty much every year. This should be an anomaly and not something that is widely accepted or expected by this fan base or this program.
Fully agree with you. So speaking of what's become an expectation for TCU fans as we kind of move through 2024, and that's men's basketball making the NCAA tournament. The last 3 years, I think the conversation now has turned to, okay, what else do you have for me? With Jamie Dixon's ball club, they've filled out their roster now. They've added 2 more guys out of the transfer portal for those last 2 scholarship spots since we last recorded, Melissa. That's Trazarien White, the Coastal Carolina kid. UNC Wilmington kid, who was the leading scorer and rebounder for the Seahawks the past 2 years. An incredible downhill scorer, elite athleticism, great slasher. Has all the potential to maybe even be the leading scorer on this program next year. And then Vasean Allette from Old Dominion, who TCU fans will recognize the name because he dropped 18 in the first half on TCU's head in the Diamond Head Classic tournament down in Hawaii before finishing with 25 points. Got into some foul trouble there in the second half that slowed him down because TCU really could not slow him down that day. He led the Monarchs in scoring and I believe assists and rebounds as a true freshman last year as well. So 2 really fun, talented, athletic pieces to round out TCU basketball's puzzle. Melissa, as you look at what TCU basketball has done in the portal with White, Allette, Frankie Collins, Noah Reynolds, RJ Jones, and Brendan Wenzel, what is your assessment of how Jamie Dixon and his coaching staff did in the portal this year?
I mean, I think going into this past season and coming off of this past season, I mean, I heard you say it, I think we all kind of knew it, that this coming season was supposed to be a little bit of a step back. You were going to start relying on younger players. Isaiah Manning, Jace Posey, who both redshirted, were going to be your most experienced players. We knew this was going to be a big transition year. But now I think what Jamie Dixon has done in the portal has made us say, never mind, you don't get a transition year. You better make the tournament again, buddy. Because considering everything that we were up against as as a program, with the way that they went out in that first round, what he was able to do in the portal was absolutely incredible. Getting high impact players, proven commodities, guys that can create their own shot, which I think was one of the biggest things that was lacking from this past year's team. You didn't have a Damian Baugh, you didn't have a Mike Miles, you didn't have one of those explosive guards that could pretty much shoot from anywhere on the floor, but was also capable of breaking some guy down off the dribble, which is what led to a lot of those 4-minute stretches and games where TCU went scoreless. I don't think, knock on wood, you're going to see many 4-minute stretches this coming season where TCU doesn't score a bucket. It can happen,
Let's
but
hope.
yeah, let's hope. But this team is more set up to not have to do that. My big concern, and I think it's a fair concern, and I've seen this presented by a myriad of TCU fans, you are relying heavily on Ernest Udeh taking not just a step forward, but a massive step forward, because if he is not capable of producing at a high level, if he's only playing the 18, 19 minutes a game he played this past season, or if he's in foul trouble, or God forbid he gets injured, there is not much size on this roster outside of him. So Jamie Dixon has built this team around Ernest Udeh being able to be on the floor and be impactful on the floor, or having to go really, really small, which will work against a lot of teams, but will get them into some trouble points of the season.
Yeah, I will commend Jamie Dixon for his willingness to shift strategies and find personnel that he thinks are more suitable for those new strategies that he wants to employ. And you kind of see that through who they brought in the portal this offseason, specifically on the offensive side of the court, because you have 6 guys coming in who are athletic creators, who are capable of scoring. And then you also brought in a guy like Frankie Collins, who's shown you he can score, but his real efficiency is creating opportunity for teammates. And so what you're sacrificing probably from a defensive standpoint is theoretically in favor of an offense that will be much more improved than it was this past year, where I can't remember how many times we talked about it, Melissa. You have a bunch of guys who can go and get you 20, but it seems like in crunch time they're all standing around looking at each other.
Yeah.
That theoretically will not be the case again in 2024, but it's likely going to come at a little bit of a cost on the defensive side of things, especially in that front court, like you mentioned, because behind Ernest Udeh, you've got David Punch, who has grown a couple inches and is probably in that 6'8", 6'9" range now. You've got Malik Diallo, who's about 6'10", 6'11". Both of those guys are true freshmen.
Yeah.
And
Diallo's a bit of a project, right?
Yeah. And so you don't really know how that's going to translate well. Brendan Wenzel's another guy who's like 6'7", 6'8". Trazarien White's listed at 6'7", but I think I've seen somewhere else that he's maybe even as short as 6'6". And so your front court, like you said, is pretty undersized. How those guys stay out of foul trouble is going to be key to what TCU men's basketball is going to be able to do next season. But I am looking forward to what this new offense looks like. A lot of screen and rolls, a lot of leaning into that athleticism where you probably will be able to out-athlete guys at times. But then it comes down to execution, being where you're supposed to be, locking in enough on defense to not make it a 100 to a 98 kind of basketball game every single night, because that's not sustainable either. And really just be responsible for yourself and for your teammates in a way that sometimes we didn't see last season. You and
I talked about it, but I kind of compared it to in 2014 when Gary Patterson brought in, Cumbie and Meacham, and just kind of said, I've won with defense my whole career, and that's clearly not where college football is going. And Jamie Dixon, to your point, basically did the same thing and said, when I was at Pitt, this is what worked for me, and it was very, very successful. But the Big 12 is becoming a conference very different than the ACC of the early 2000s,
Big
right?
East,
Yeah, I guess it was the Big East back then. Jeez. So I think that he's really smart to address what's been holding this team back, which has been the offense. They weren't a good enough defensive team in order to be that bad an offensive team. So there's still some athleticism. There's still some ability. I still think they'll be pretty decent rebounders, even though they are a little bit undersized. But I'm excited to see this team doesn't have to just get out and run and out athlete people in order to be able to score on people, but they'll still be able to do so. I don't think they'll lead the team, lead the nation in fast break points like they did at the beginning of this season, but I expect them to be, in the probably the top third of Power 4 teams doing so. So it's going to be fun. There's a lot of talent. Where's the leadership going to come from? That's question number one. I think you and I both have a lot of expectation that Isaiah Manning and Jace Posey can be those guys, but they're going to have to play in order to be those guys, right? They're going to have to earn their spots and earn their minutes, and there'll be some good competition. I think the coaching staff it's going to be on them to get this to be a synchronous unit pretty quickly. They won't have the benefit of a European trip or something like they've had in the past. So it's going to be fun to watch. It's going to be interesting to watch. I think you can project this team to be pretty competitive in the Big 12 and to be, potentially a bubble NCAA tournament team. I don't think we should go into that as an expectation this year, but we'll have to kind of see how their preseason goes before we can determine what their ceiling is.
And we're not, we're going to get a sense of what this new Big 12 looks like, too.
Yeah.
Bringing in Arizona, Colorado, Arizona State, Utah, not to mention Kansas fully reloaded. Kansas State and Texas Tech have done pretty well in the portal. Baylor has excelled in the portal after keeping Scott Drew from leaving for Kentucky.
Yeah.
You've got what is potentially one of the deeper years in a Big 12 that has already been consistently one of the best conferences in the country, if not the best. And, I haven't even mentioned Houston yet.
Yeah.
Right.
They were pretty good last year.
They were pretty good. They were pretty okay winning the conference in their first year in the league. So, I'm just curious to see where TCU stacks up in this new version of the Big 12 with what they've done in the portal. I think Dixon and his staff have done a pretty good job of offsetting what should have been a transition year with talent that they brought in. But now it's about, how does that talent gel? How does that talent bear out on the court? And can they sustain some of the things they want to do offensively in a league that does still play, for the most part, pretty high-level defense?
Yeah. It's going to be fun. I think it's going to be fun. I think this is going to be a fun and a likable team, easy to root for, and I think we'll get to see some pretty fun athleticism on display. So, another team that plays in that same arena that's going to be pretty fun this year is the TCU women's basketball team. That,
yes.
We've talked about a lot how excited we all got this last season before injuries absolutely devastated them. You talk about somebody being able to remake a team on the fly in the portal. Good Lord, Mark Campbell is an absolute genius. He is absolutely killing it. So they brought in, they found the bigs that TCU needs, TCU men's basketball needs at least, with a couple of backup centers, which is going to be great because you get Sedona Prince for one more season. But you didn't really have anybody behind her, and last year because of injuries, they didn't have anybody when she went down really that could do what she did. So they bring in a Georgia State transfer, Deja Merrill, who started her career at Kentucky, I believe, had an injury issue. Came back. It's taken her kind of 2 years to round back into form, but she was 8 points, 6.5 rebounds per game, shot 50% from the floor. She can sling it from outside too when called upon. Not a great 3-point shooter, but enough to be dangerous. And then South Dakota center Natalie Mazurek as well, who averaged 7.5 and a block a game. So that puts the roster at 13. Women's basketball has 15 full scholarships, so he still has some room to play with. Whether or not he uses those probably depends how the summer goes. You could still see some, I think there's one more portal opportunity, or maybe it's just graduate transfers at this point. I can't keep up with them anymore, but they have some spots if they choose to fill them. But right now, if you look at the way this roster is constructed, he's got pretty elite players in his starting five, and his depth is very, very solid. So this is a team that should be very, very competitive in a Big 12 that's almost as good on the women's side as on the men's side. But he has stars, and he also has star power, which is going to be important when we see what's happening with women's basketball right now. And Haley Van Lith and Sedona Prince and Madison Connor, I think, has a chance to, if she starts shooting like she started shooting last year. This is a team that I think is going to draw a ton of attention, a ton of interest, and really does look like an NCAA tournament team. And if they could get that program back to the tournament, that would be a huge deal, not just for TCU, but just for Mark Campbell and establishing this as one of the elite programs. And I've already seen a couple people start going, man, like this Mark Campbell guy's pretty good. What are we going to have to do to keep him? So I think if you can develop into a powerhouse, I think there's an opportunity for him to have a lot of the resources that he wants. And TCU has been great about stepping up and helping him sign the players he wants to sign. But we know that's a hard thing to do these days. So I'm super excited for the men's season, but I am really excited for women's basketball this year and to watch those women get out and play and compete at what I think will be a really high level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the portal ads that I'm most excited about beyond HVL, Maddie Scher, some of these other kids that are older transfer portal ads is Donovan Hunter, the point guard from Oregon
Gosh, it's
State,
gonna be
who
so good.
was just a freshman this year, was first team all freshman in the Pac-12 this past season, comes with 3 years of eligibility remaining, and could truly be that kind of point guard bridge to future seasons beyond this one, with the way that she can shoot the ball, the way that she can distribute to teammates. She is kind of that embodiment of everything that Jaden Owens was for TCU to begin the year, and to have someone with multiple years of eligibility coming into the program, can learn the system, can really kind of take it over, and be an understudy to Haley Van Lith and Maddie Scher for the first year before taking the reins herself. I think that's invaluable to not only the team this upcoming season, but making sure that TCU continues on the early trajectory that we're kind of projecting for the years to come under Mark Campbell. So super excited about her, and really this entire portal class. Like you said, Mark Campbell's been absolutely on fire, building something that is going to be immediately competitive, not only in conference, but in the NCAA.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to watch for sure. So, Jamie, you brought it up earlier, but we want to make sure that we give a shout out to our sponsor, Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods. We talked about the Great Memorial Day sale. By the time you're listening to this, that sale is over. But there will be more. What Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods is doing is creating just some of the best, most iconic, and most unique TCU merchandise out there. So during the season, there were sweep shirts. Every time TCU baseball swept the series, which was a lot of fun, a lot of creativity there. Their hoodies are super, super comfortable. They've got great game day polos. Pretty much everything you need for your tailgate or TCU fan gating experience you can find at Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods. It's an organization that supports TCU athletes, and supports us. So we hope that you guys will check out Hell's Half Acre Stadium Goods at hellshalfacresg.com, and buy some really great stuff, high quality gear. I said I bought a quarter zip and a hoodie during the sale, and
Nice.
Have bought multiple shirts and stuff this season too. So lots of great sales going on. You can always find stuff at a discount, but support the folks that support TCU and support the folks that support us, and get some cool merch ahead of the fall for a new TCU football season. And thank God a new athletic season, because this year was rough at Hell's Half Acre Stadium.
Not all of it was rough, right? Let's talk a little bit of men's tennis here, because they won a national championship for the first time in program history. I watched most of this match last Sunday. It was absolutely riveting. Of course, it was against Texas, someone that they're so intimately familiar with, having played, I think, 14 times in the last 3 years or something absolutely obnoxious. To have it come down to the last court, Sebastian Gorzny clutching it up, getting the dub, winning the national title, watching TCU celebrate on that court, seeing David Roditi finally climb to the top of the mountain, something that he's been so close to doing with this program since he stepped foot back on campus as the head coach. Really cool, just all of the storylines that are kind of intertwined there. Roditi being an alum, coming back and coaching and winning a title, all of the guys that kind of came in, JPJ stepping up and absolutely being dominant in the last two sets of his
beating the
match.
number one player in the world,
just absolutely killing it. And they beat an Ohio State team in the semifinal that knocked them off in the championship in the indoor season. So a little bit of redemption there en route to their first natty ever. Just so cool to see. So happy for that program. And it kind of leads into what you were talking about with women's hoops, Melissa, and that's the TCU has shown a willingness to support some of those quote-unquote non-revenue sports to the point where they are nationally competitive, and that's a sustained level. With women's rifle, we saw obviously equestrian in the national championship this year. Now men's tennis wins the national championship. Soccer has been dominant for a very long time under Eric Bell. Now you have women's basketball in the mix there as well. I think Jeremiah Donati has done a fantastic job of making sure that while it's appropriate to pay more attention to things like football, men's basketball, even baseball, those other sports, quote-unquote other sports, have all of the resources that they need to be competitive at the highest level. And that is a balancing act that a lot of athletics departments get wrong. And it's a balancing act that is not easy on a day-to-day basis as you're divvying up a limited amount of resources. So props to Jeremiah Donati for doing the hard work of making sure that some of these other sports that could easily be forgotten about are still competitive on a national scale.
Yeah, and I think, obviously now the question becomes, what do you do to keep TCU tennis there? And there have been long talks about doing some remodeling on the outdoor courts and their indoor facility needs. So now it's you get what you came to get, and you win a national championship, and now you're like, this is the best time in the world for me to ask for more, because I just won
Right.
first men's national championship at TCU since I think the 80s, right? This first team championship. So it's a huge deal. A national championship is a huge deal. TCU fans have done a great job supporting tennis. I mean, that home crowd is one of the best in college tennis anywhere.
It helps that Roditi provides free alcohol.
It does
I will
help.
say that.
It
and
does
if you
help.
didn't know that, and you're a TCU fan that lives in Fort Worth, get out to a men's tennis match,
Yeah.
have a drink, and watch them kick some ass.
Yeah, and they will do so. Now, the thing that you talked about, Sebastian Gorzny having the clinching, well, Seb, we're gonna love you forever for that moment. But he basically, I don't know what the comparison is, but the dude like wins the war and then immediately goes and says, "I'm gonna go play for the losers," because Gorzny almost immediately entered the transfer portal and signed with the University of Texas. Now he is an Austin kid. So this may have been a long time dream and opportunity, and he, strike while the iron is hot. If it's the kind of the opposite. If you can't beat them, join them. If they kick your ass, then go ahead and take the player that did so. I get it. I don't fault the kid at all for wanting to go, play for UT. It's super disappointing for TCU fans and TCU tennis. But again, coming off a national championship, if there's an opportunity for Dave Roditi to replace a great player like Sebastian Gorzny with a portal prospect, I have a feeling he'll be able to do so.
Did he sign with Texas?
Yes, he
I
committed.
missed that. Okay.
Yeah, he did commit to Texas. So just such an absolute bummer. But again, this is the new era, and to see it coming down to even, non-revenue sports like tennis, like, are we gonna start losing our rifle players to the portal? Like, I don't know how this works. Like, are the horses from equestrian going to be transferring to OSU? Like, I don't. Where do they get like extra hay in Stillwater? I don't know how all of this works, but it is a little bit disappointing to see a kid have that moment and then go join the enemy. But at least we don't have to worry about playing him next year.
He got his ring, and now he can go be happy in Austin, Texas. That's great, because
good for him.
and I can't fault the kid for wanting to go home.
No.
I mean,
No,
look at all
not at all.
the quote unquote hometown kids TCU has taken out of the portal over the last few years across different sports.
Yeah.
So go
The portal
be
give it,
happy
the
in
portal
Austin.
Taketh away.
Do your thing, and we'll see you. We'll probably see you in the playoffs next year,
Yeah,
Sebastian.
see you in the postseason. So
for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Melissa. I think that's just about going to do it for this episode of Frogs Insider. We will be back a week from now. I'm not sure what we'll talk about, but probably get more in depth on what TCU baseball has going for it in the transfer portal.
Yeah.
There were some football commits that we can touch on that we didn't get to today in this episode.
Hey, track and field athletes are still running. We still have some track guys out in Eugene.
They're always running. Yes, we got some folks
so
headed to Eugene for the NCAA championships as well. So we'll get into some of the TNF.
Maybe this
in
becomes an
TCU.
off-season barbecue podcast for a couple of weeks.
Look, I wouldn't mind judging some barbecue. I've eaten plenty of it. I've got some opinions. So
yeah,
we
you
can
and me
dive in. And then maybe we even relive some of the finer moments in TCU athletics history this summer.
That's a good idea.
Melissa.
I like
we
that.
can dive into some of that.
It won't be
but
from
yes,
many from this season, but there's
years
been other
past,
years.
like 2022.
Yeah.
But that'll do it for this episode of Frogs Insider. She's Melissa Treebwasser. I'm Jamie Plunkett, and we will talk to you next time. Go Frogs.
Go Frogs.